My name is Paige Landry. I'm 33 years old, from Annapolis, Maryland. This is the story of how I spent my entire life trying to be good enough for people who never planned to see me, and how I finally stopped begging for a seat at a table that was never built for me. I'm going to say this up front because I know some of you need to hear it early. This isn't a revenge story about screaming, slamming doors, or cutting people off overnight. This is a quiet story, a realistic one, the kind that happens slowly, while you're busy being responsible, useful, and exhausted. And no, the ending isn't what you think. So stay with me. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. Waterfront property, manicured lawn, private dock, a last name people recognized before they recognized me. My parents loved to tell people how lucky I was. Lucky to be born into the Landry family. Lucky to have opportunities. Lucky to be taken care of. But what they didn't say, what nobody ever says, is how early you learn that lucky comes with conditions. I learned it young. Love was performance-based. Approval was transactional. And usefulness? That was the currency. I was the daughter who didn't cause problems, the one who adapted, the one who helped. If something needed organizing, I did it. If someone needed smoothing over, I handled it. If my parents needed an image polished, I became the polish. And for a long time, I told myself that was just what being a good daughter looked like. By my late 20s, I was exhausted in a way sleep didn't fix. On paper, I was doing fine. I had my own apartment in Eastport, a stable job, no scandals, no messes. But I also had a permanent knot in my chest, the kind that comes from constantly measuring yourself through other people's expectations. Every family dinner felt like a performance review. Why aren't you further along? Why don't you date someone more established? Why are you always so sensitive? And the unspoken one that hung over everything. What are you doing that actually benefits us? Then I met Ethan. Not at a gala, not through a good family, not through any circle my parents respected. I met him at a marina. He was working on a restoration job, hands dirty, sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in fixing something most people would have thrown away. He didn't try to impress me, didn't ask about my last name, didn't treat me like a resume. He asked what I liked, what I cared about, what made me tired. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like I had to earn someone's interest. That terrified me. When I brought Ethan home to meet my parents for the first time, I already knew it wasn't going to go well. I just didn't realize how clearly it would expose everything I'd been avoiding. My father asked what Ethan did for a living before dinner was even served. My mother smiled the tight smile she uses when she's already decided. They weren't cruel. They didn't yell. They did something worse. They dismissed him. And by extension, they dismissed me. Later that night, my father pulled me aside and spoke softly, the way people do when they think they're being reasonable. He told me I was throwing my future away, that love didn't pay bills, that certain standards existed for a reason. He reminded me, very gently, what I stood to lose if I didn't think carefully. I remember standing there, nodding, feeling like I was 12 again. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't afraid of losing their money. I was afraid of losing their approval, even though it had never really been mine. That night, lying awake in my apartment, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for years. If I stripped everything away, the expectations, the family name, the pressure, who was I actually living for? The answer scared me, because it wasn't me. Over the next few months, the pressure intensified. Subtle comments, well-timed comparisons, helpful introductions to men I didn't ask to meet. Every conversation came back to the same theme. You're being emotional. You don't see the big picture. We just want what's best for you. And I realized something painful but clarifying. They didn't see me as a person making choices. They saw me as an extension of their legacy, something to be managed. Ethan never told me what to do. He never tried to save me. He just stayed. And in that quiet consistency, I started to feel something unfamiliar. Respect. Not because of what I provided, not because of how I performed, but because of who I was. That contrast changed everything. The breaking point didn't come with a fight. It came with a file folder slid across my father's desk. 3 names inside, 3 men, 3 lives chosen for me. Pick one, he said, or walk away. That was the moment I finally understood. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. And for the first time in my life, I didn't say yes. That decision set everything else in motion. Things I didn't know, plans I hadn't seen, a truth about my own family that would change the balance of power forever. But none of that happened yet. At this point in the story, all I knew was this. I was done shrinking. Done negotiating my worth. Done proving I deserved a life that already felt like mine. And I had no idea how much that choice was about to cost them. By the time Ethan and I got engaged, the tension in my family wasn't loud anymore. It was polished, strategic, the kind that wears pearls and speaks in full sentences. My parents stopped arguing with me directly. Instead, they started managing the narrative around me. They told relatives I was confused. They told friends I was going through a phase. They told business partners I was being influenced. And the worst part? I let it happen longer than I should have, because a part of me still hoped they'd come around. I'd been financially independent from my parents for years by then. I paid my own rent. I paid my own bills. I built my own routines. But independence isn't just about money. It's about emotional permission. And I hadn't taken that yet. Every Sunday dinner still felt mandatory. Every call still carried weight. Every disappointed sigh still landed like a verdict. They never said, "We'll cut you off." They didn't need to. They said things like, "We just don't want you to struggle. We worked too hard for you to throw this away. You'll thank us one day." That's how control works when it's learned, not shouted. Around that time, something strange happened. A letter arrived at my apartment. Heavy paper, foreign stamp. My name handwritten on the envelope. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, but the handwriting stopped me cold. It was my grandfather's. He'd passed away more than a decade earlier, long before I met Ethan, long before I started pushing back, long before I learned how much silence can cost. Inside the envelope was a formal notice from a Swiss bank. Short, precise, almost cold. It explained that a trust my grandfather had created years ago had just become eligible for full review. 2 conditions were listed. I read them twice, then a third time. First, I had to live financially independent from my parents for a minimum of 3 consecutive years. I had. Second, I had to be engaged to the person I intended to marry of my own free will. I sat there at my kitchen table, coffee going cold, hands shaking. My parents had never mentioned this trust. Not once. That night, when Ethan came over after work, I handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it quietly. Then he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not shock, not excitement. Recognition. "There's more," he said carefully. And that's when he told me the truth he'd been carrying alone for years. After my grandfather died, small blocks of company shares started quietly moving through offshore channels. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, just enough to go unnoticed. Ethan had noticed. Not because he was looking for power, but because he understands systems the way some people understand emotions. He followed the trail, asked the right questions, stayed patient. And slowly, methodically, he acquired influence my parents assumed they still controlled. Not for leverage, not for revenge, but because, as he put it, I didn't trust people who cared more about status than craft. That sentence hit me harder than anything my parents had ever said. Suddenly, the past started making sense. Why my grandfather always spoke to me differently. Why he insisted I learn the business, not the parties. Why he warned me once that legacy attracts the wrong kind of hunger. He had seen what my parents became, and he had planned for it. Not to punish them, but to protect what mattered. And somehow, he had trusted me. At the same time, my parents doubled down. They planned an engagement party without asking what I wanted, invited people I hadn't spoken to in years, chose venues that screamed image instead of joy. When I hesitated, my mother said quietly, "Don't embarrass us." That word, us, told me everything. I started counting days without telling anyone. Not out loud, just in my head. How long until I stopped negotiating my life with people who saw me as a tool? Ethan noticed the shift. I was calmer, more observant, less reactive. He didn't ask questions. He just matched my pace. We started preparing, not emotionally, but practically. Lawyers, documents, contingencies. Not to attack, to end the cycle cleanly. I still went to family dinners, still smiled, still listened, but something fundamental had changed. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was waiting. The engagement party arrived in early fall. Perfect weather, perfect setting, perfect audience. My father stood to give a toast. It started warm. Then it turned. He talked about responsibility, about protecting a legacy, about making choices worthy of a name. And then, without raising his voice, he questioned whether the man I loved was capable of carrying that weight. In public, in front of everyone. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I smiled. And that smile unsettled him more than anger ever could. Because in that moment, I finally saw it clearly. They believed humiliation would bring me back in line. They had no idea how much ground they'd already lost. That night, as Ethan and I drove home in silence, he said something that still echoes in my mind. "They think this is about winning." He glanced at me, steady hands on the wheel. "It's not. It's about ending it." I looked out at the water, dark and calm, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready. The weeks leading up to the wedding were strangely quiet, not peaceful. Quiet in the way a room gets when everyone is pretending not to see the crack in the wall. My parents stopped pushing openly. Instead, they started acting relieved, as if they believed the storm had passed. My mother sent venue updates like nothing had happened, My father forwarded guest lists and seating charts. They spoke to me in the tone people use when they think resistance has been resolved. I let them. Not because I agreed, but because I finally understood something crucial. They didn't need my consent anymore. They thought they already owned the ending. Behind the scenes, everything was moving. Lawyers confirmed timelines, documents were notarized, scanned, duplicated. Every legal trigger aligned with calm, boring precision. Nothing dramatic. That's how real power moves. I learned more in those months than I had in my entire upbringing. Not about money, but about leverage. Who panics? Who postures? Who collapses when control slips even slightly? And my parents? They were still playing the same game they'd always played. They just didn't realize the board had changed. The last Sunday dinner before the wedding was the clearest illustration of who they really were. Same dining room, same china, same script. My father commented on Ethan's job again, casually, as if it were harmless conversation. My mother asked, for the third time that evening, whether I was sure this was the life I wanted. Then she said the sentence that finally ended something in me. "You know," she sighed, "after everything we've done for you, this feels incredibly ungrateful." There it was, the emotional invoice. I didn't argue. I didn't defend Ethan. I didn't explain myself. I simply nodded and said, "I hear you," and meant something entirely different than she thought. That night, lying next to Ethan, I stared at the ceiling and felt a strange calm settle in, the kind that comes when you stop hoping people will change, when you stop negotiating with ghosts. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. And being done is quieter than rage, but far more final. The decision wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation. It was acceptance. Acceptance that my parents loved an idea of me, not the real person. Acceptance that nothing I did would ever be enough unless it served their image. Acceptance that if I wanted peace, I had to stop asking permission to live. That was the night I chose myself. Fully. Without apology. The plan didn't involve humiliation. It involved truth. Public truth. Because private truth had been ignored for decades. My parents believed appearances were armor. They had built their entire identity on being untouchable. So we didn't attack from the shadows. We waited for the stage they built themselves. The wedding. They wanted it big, impressive, symbolic. A gathering of everyone who mattered to them. They thought it would seal my compliance. They never asked why I agreed so easily. In the final weeks, I watched my parents carefully. My father grew more confident, almost smug. My mother grew more sentimental, already framing herself as the long-suffering matriarch. They talked about the future as if I'd already surrendered. Children, legacy, responsibilities. They spoke over me, about me, like I wasn't in the room. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I felt observant. The night before the wedding, Ethan gave me something small. Not jewelry, not a grand gesture. It was a piece of brass from the first yacht my grandfather ever built. Worn, imperfect, real. "This," he said quietly, "is what lasts." I cried, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally understood what I was choosing. Not wealth, not rebellion, but integrity. The morning of the wedding was cold and clear, the kind of day that makes everything look sharper. Guests arrived early, phones buzzed, whispers filled the space. My parents were in perfect form, smiling, hosting, performing. And then, just before the ceremony, something snapped. As I stepped into view, my parents stood, together, not to bless us, not to congratulate us, but to stop us. My father spoke first, loud enough for everyone to hear. His words weren't dramatic. They were cruel in the way only people who know you well can be. My mother followed, tears ready, voice shaking, framing herself as the wounded one. They questioned my judgment, my worth, my future as a mother, in front of everyone, on purpose. This was their final attempt to reclaim control through shame, and it would have worked years ago. The room froze. Every eye turned toward me, waiting for tears, for collapse, for compliance. Instead, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because clarity had finally arrived. I turned, took Ethan's hand, and walked forward. Not away, through it. I spoke first, calm, steady. I thanked my parents, sincerely, for making something very clear, that their love had always been conditional. Then Ethan spoke, and when he did, the illusion shattered, not with insults, not with threats, with facts, documents, ownership, truth. The kind that doesn't argue, it simply exists. My parents tried to interrupt. They couldn't. They tried to deny. They failed. Because for the first time in their lives, the audience wasn't on their side. The story they had told for decades unraveled in minutes, and I watched something I never thought I'd see: power leaving a room. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relieved, as if a weight I'd been carrying since childhood had finally been set down, not destroyed, just released. When we walked out together, the ceremony unfinished, the silence behind us was deafening. Not shocked silence, reckoning silence. And I knew, without doubt, that nothing would ever be the same again. We didn't finish the ceremony that day. There was no dramatic exit music, no final toast, no cinematic kiss in front of the crowd. We simply walked out, and that was enough. The fallout didn't come all at once. It came in waves: emails, calls, voicemails left at strange hours, some furious, some pleading, some pretending nothing had happened. My parents tried every version of the same tactic they'd used my whole life: anger, guilt, victimhood. When that didn't work, they tried silence. That one hurt the most, but only for a little while, because something unexpected happened. Without the constant noise, I could finally hear myself. Legally, everything unfolded exactly as planned. No chaos, no screaming headlines, just meetings, votes, signatures. People who had spent years orbiting my parents suddenly adjusted their posture when they spoke to me, not because I demanded it, because power has gravity, and it had shifted. My father lost his position quietly. My mother lost her influence even faster. The systems they relied on were never built to protect people without leverage. They had taught me that lesson without realizing it. Emotionally, the reckoning took longer. I didn't wake up free overnight. There were moments I reached for my phone out of habit, to ask for approval, to explain myself, to soften something that didn't need softening. Then I remembered. I didn't owe them translation anymore. Ethan and I didn't move into anything extravagant. We didn't upgrade our lives the way people expected. We stayed near the water, near work that felt real, near people who knew our names before they knew our titles. Our home became quieter. No performances, no roles. Just two adults building something without an audience. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how things ended, if I wish I'd handled it differently, if I feel guilty. Here's the truth, the one no one prepares you for. You don't miss the people who hurt you. You miss the version of them you kept hoping they'd become. And letting go of that hope, that's the hardest part. I used to believe family meant unconditional access, that blood justified everything. But I've learned something better. Love without respect isn't love. Sacrifice without choice isn't noble. It's erasure. And loyalty that only flows upward? That's not family. That's extraction. Today, my life looks smaller from the outside. Fewer events, fewer obligations, fewer people who feel entitled to me. But on the inside, it's larger than it's ever been. I wake up without dread. I make decisions without rehearsing explanations. I rest without guilt. That alone is worth everything I lost. If you're watching this and something in your chest feels tight, if you've spent years being the responsible one, the strong one, the one who understands, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not selfish for wanting a life that doesn't drain you. You are not ungrateful for refusing to be used. And you are not broken because setting boundaries feels terrifying. It feels terrifying because it works. You don't have to burn bridges. You don't have to prove anything. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step out of a role that was never designed for your happiness. Build a life that doesn't require your exhaustion as proof of love. The people who truly belong in it won't ask you to disappear to make them comfortable. That's not rebellion. That's adulthood. And if no one's told you this yet, you're allowed to choose yourself, even if they don't understand, especially if they don't.